In the chaos of battle, rank and respect are earned with blood, not bestowed with badges. When bullets fly and lives hang in the balance, the person holding the medical kit often becomes the most important soldier on the battlefield. This is the story of Sarah Chen, a 24-year-old combat medic whose quiet determination and unwavering courage would transform her from an overlooked support soldier into a legendary hero. In a world where being called just a medic was meant to diminish her worth, Sarah would prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a rifle, it's the steady hands of someone who refuses to let others die on her watch. Sarah Chen had always been smaller than her peers, but what she lacked in physical stature, she made up for in fierce determination. Growing up in a military family in San Diego, she had watched her father return from deployment after deployment, his eyes carrying stories he never shared. Her mother worked as a nurse at the local hospital, often coming home exhausted but fulfilled, knowing she had made a difference in someone's life. It was this combination of service and healing that drew Sarah to become a combat medic. The training at Fort Sam Houston was brutal. While other soldiers learned to destroy, Sarah learned to preserve. She memorized every bone in the human body, every pressure point that could stop bleeding, every technique that could keep a heart beating when it wanted to stop. Her instructors pushed her harder than the others, knowing that in combat, medics faced unique challenges. They had to be warriors and healers simultaneously, ready to fight one moment and save lives the next. Sarah's first assignment came with the 82nd Airborne Division, deploying to Afghanistan's Kandahar province. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, with mountains that seemed to scrape the sky and valleys that could hide entire enemy forces. The forward operating base, Camp Dwyer, sat like a small island of American military might in a sea of uncertainty. Here, Sarah quickly learned that respect wasn't automatically given to medics, especially not to young women who looked like they might blow away in a strong wind. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Rodriguez commanded the base with an iron fist and old-school military pride. A veteran of 3 previous deployments, Rodriguez had earned his position through decades of tactical brilliance and unwavering leadership. He was the kind of commander who inspired fierce loyalty among his troops, but he also held traditional views about battlefield roles. In his mind, medics were support personnel, necessary but not central to military success. Combat belonged to the infantrymen, the real warriors who carried rifles and charged enemy positions. From her first day at Camp Dwyer, Sarah felt the weight of skeptical stares and dismissive comments. During morning briefings, Rodriguez's eyes would pass over her as if she were part of the furniture. When tactical decisions were discussed, her input was neither requested nor welcomed. The message was clear. She was there to patch up wounds, not to contribute to strategy or operations. The other soldiers, taking their cue from their commander, treated her with polite but distant professionalism. The dismissive attitude became particularly apparent during a routine patrol briefing. Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson, a seasoned infantry leader with multiple tours under his belt, was outlining the route through a village suspected of harboring insurgent activity. Sarah raised her hand, having studied the intelligence reports and noticing concerning patterns in recent casualty reports from similar operations. "Sir, I've been reviewing the medical data from patrols in this area over the past month," she said, her voice steady despite the sudden attention of 30 pairs of eyes. "There's been a significant increase in IED injuries along this specific route, particularly near the market area. The blast patterns suggest the devices are being positioned to maximize casualties among our forces." Thompson's expression remained unchanged, but there was a hint of irritation in his voice when he responded. "Thank you, Doc, but we've got the tactical situation handled." "Your job is to be ready when we bring back the wounded." Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "Chen, we appreciate your medical expertise, but leave the tactical planning to the combat personnel. Focus on making sure your aid station is properly stocked and your equipment is ready." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with frustration, but she simply nodded and returned to her notes. She had learned early that arguing with superior officers was a quick way to make enemies, but that didn't mean she was wrong about what she had observed. The medical reports painted a clear picture of escalating danger, and her training had taught her to see patterns that others might miss. Life at Camp Dwyer settled into a routine punctuated by sudden bursts of intense activity. Sarah spent her days treating everything from minor scrapes to serious combat injuries. She stitched up wounds from shrapnel, treated infections, and provided emergency care for soldiers injured in IED blasts. Each case taught her something new about trauma medicine, and she began to develop a reputation among the enlisted men for her skill and calm demeanor under pressure. Despite the professional respect she was earning from the soldiers she treated, the command staff continued to view her as peripheral to their mission. During officer meetings, she was rarely invited unless specifically medical issues were being discussed. Strategic planning sessions proceeded without any input from the medical team, despite the fact that Sarah and her colleagues had intimate knowledge of enemy tactics based on the wounds they treated. The turning point came during a particularly challenging week in November. Intelligence reports indicated increased insurgent activity in the region and patrols were being hit with greater frequency. Sarah found herself working longer hours in the aid station, treating a steady stream of soldiers with injuries ranging from minor shrapnel wounds to severe blast trauma. Each patient told a piece of a larger story about enemy movements and tactics. One evening, as she was updating patient records, Sarah noticed something troubling. The pattern of injuries over the past week suggested that insurgent forces were using increasingly sophisticated tactics. The placement of IEDs indicated detailed knowledge of American patrol routes, and the types of secondary devices being employed suggested professional military training among the enemy forces. She spent hours that night cross-referencing injury reports with patrol routes and timing. What she discovered was deeply concerning. Someone was providing detailed intelligence to insurgent forces about American operations. The medical evidence painted a clear picture of compromised security, but she knew that presenting this information would require careful preparation and undeniable proof. The next morning, Sarah requested a private meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez. His aide initially tried to deflect her request, suggesting she could discuss any medical concerns with the base medical officer. However, Sarah insisted that her concerns went beyond routine medical matters and required the commander's immediate attention. Rodriguez received her in his office with barely concealed impatience. His desk was covered with tactical maps and intelligence reports, and he made no effort to hide his irritation at being interrupted from more important matters. "This better be urgent, Chen," he said without looking up from his paperwork. "I've got a major operation planning session in 20 minutes. Sarah placed a folder on his desk containing her analysis of injury patterns and patrol data. "Sir, I believe we have a serious security breach that's putting our soldiers at unnecessary risk." For the first time since she entered his office, Rodriguez looked directly at her. There was skepticism in his eyes, but also a hint of curiosity about what had prompted such a bold statement from someone he considered support personnel. "Go on," he said, leaning back in his chair. Sarah opened the folder and began presenting her findings. She showed him how injury patterns correlated with specific patrol routes, how the timing of attacks suggested detailed knowledge of operational schedules, and how the sophistication of secondary devices indicated professional military training among attackers. Her presentation was methodical and thorough, backed by weeks of careful observation and analysis. As she spoke, Rodriguez's expression gradually shifted from skepticism to serious attention. The medical evidence she presented was compelling and painted a picture that aligned with troubling intelligence reports he had been receiving from other sources. However, accepting her analysis would mean acknowledging that a medic had identified a critical security threat that his intelligence staff had missed. "These are serious allegations, Chen," Rodriguez said finally. "You're suggesting that someone with access to our operational details is providing intelligence to enemy forces." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied firmly. "The medical evidence strongly supports that conclusion. The precision of these attacks isn't random. Someone is feeding them detailed information about our movements." Rodriguez studied the documents for several minutes, his military mind processing the implications of what she was presenting. If Sarah was correct, it meant that upcoming operations were already compromised, putting American lives at serious risk. However, acting on intelligence provided by a medic would require him to set aside his preconceptions about battlefield roles and military hierarchy. "I'll need to verify this analysis with my intelligence staff," Rodriguez said finally. "But if you're right about this, Chen, it could save a lot of American lives." As Sarah left his office, she felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had done her duty as a soldier by reporting what she believed to be a serious threat, but she also knew that challenging established hierarchies could have consequences for her career. However, her primary concern wasn't personal advancement. It was ensuring that her fellow soldiers returned home safely to their families. The investigation that followed confirmed Sarah's suspicions in the most dramatic way possible. Within 48 hours, military intelligence had identified a local contractor with access to operational schedules who had been providing information to insurgent forces. The man had been using his position as a translator to gather intelligence that was directly responsible for at least a dozen American casualties over the previous month. Word of Sarah's role in uncovering the security breach spread quickly through the base, fundamentally changing how she was perceived by both officers and enlisted personnel. Soldiers who had previously seen her as just another support person began to understand that her medical training had given her unique insights into enemy tactics and capabilities. Her ability to read the story told by wounds and injuries had literally saved lives. However, this recognition came with new challenges and responsibilities. Rodriguez began including Sarah in tactical planning sessions, seeking her input on medical intelligence and threat assessment. Other officers, initially resistant to accepting tactical advice from a medic, gradually began to appreciate the unique perspective she brought to operational planning.
The transformation wasn't immediate or complete.
Military culture changes slowly, and there were still those who viewed Sarah's expanded role with skepticism or resentment. Some saw her rise in influence as a threat to established hierarchies, while others questioned whether medical personnel should be involved in tactical decision-making. But Sarah had proven something important. Effective military operations required diverse perspectives and expertise. Her medical training hadn't made her less of a soldier, it had given her tools for understanding the battlefield that complemented traditional military intelligence. The wounds she treated told stories about enemy capabilities, tactical innovations, and operational security that couldn't be gathered through conventional means. As the weeks passed, Sarah found herself increasingly involved in mission planning and threat assessment. Her ability to analyze injury patterns and predict enemy tactics became a valuable asset in protecting American forces. However, she also knew that her greatest challenge lay ahead. Proving her worth through analysis was one thing. Demonstrating courage under fire would be the ultimate test of her value as a soldier and leader. The December morning started like any other at Camp Dwyer, with the familiar sounds of soldiers preparing for another day of operations in hostile territory. Sarah had been awake since 0400 hours, checking her medical supplies and reviewing intelligence reports for the day's planned missions. The increased respect she had earned over the past month felt good, but she knew that proving herself once didn't guarantee continued acceptance in the male-dominated military hierarchy. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez had been including her in more tactical discussions, but she could sense the underlying tension among some of the other officers. Staff Sergeant Thompson, in particular, seemed resentful of her elevated status. During briefings, he would make subtle comments about staying in one's lane and focusing on primary responsibilities. The message was clear. Despite her recent success, many still saw her as an outsider trying to exceed her proper role. The morning briefing was tense with anticipation. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target, a Taliban commander, responsible for numerous attacks on coalition forces, was meeting with local insurgent leaders in a compound approximately 15 kilometers from the base. The operation would involve a complex infiltration through hostile territory, followed by a coordinated assault designed to capture or eliminate the target while minimizing civilian casualties. Rodriguez outlined the mission parameters with his characteristic precision. 3 squads would approach the compound from different directions, with helicopter support providing overwatch and extraction capability if needed. The plan was solid, based on weeks of intelligence gathering and careful reconnaissance. However, Sarah noticed something in the medical briefing materials that concerned her. Recent casualty reports from the target area indicated the presence of advanced medical facilities and trained medical personnel among insurgent forces. This suggested that enemy fighters in the region were receiving sophisticated medical training and had access to equipment that would allow them to treat serious combat injuries. For American forces, this meant that wounded enemies might be able to return to combat more quickly than anticipated, and that the insurgent forces were likely better prepared for sustained engagement than intelligence estimates suggested. During the briefing, Sarah raised her hand to present her observations. The room fell silent as 30 pairs of eyes turned toward her, and she could feel the familiar mixture of curiosity and skepticism that her contributions now generated. Sir, the medical intelligence suggests we may be facing more organized opposition than anticipated, she began, her voice steady despite the intense scrutiny. The quality of medical care available to insurgent forces in this area indicates professional military medical training and significant resources. This could affect our casualty estimates and extraction planning. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully, but Thompson's response was immediate and dismissive. Doc, we appreciate the medical perspective, but this is a tactical operation. Our intelligence team has thoroughly assessed the threat level, and we're prepared for the resistance we expect to encounter. Sarah felt her frustration rising, but maintained her professional composure. Sergeant, I understand the tactical assessment, but medical intelligence can provide crucial insights into enemy capabilities and organization. The presence of advanced medical facilities suggests. Chen, Rodriguez interrupted, his tone suggesting that the discussion was over. Your concerns are noted, but we need to proceed with the planned operation. Make sure your trauma team is ready for potential casualties, and prepare for possible mass casualty situations. The meeting concluded with final equipment checks and coordination details. Sarah left the briefing room feeling frustrated but determined to ensure that her medical team was prepared for whatever might develop during the operation. She spent the next hour reviewing trauma protocols with her medics and ensuring that emergency medical supplies were loaded onto the helicopters that would provide support for the mission. As the assault teams prepared to depart, Sarah made a decision that would prove to be crucial. Despite not being assigned to accompany the mission, she approached Rodriguez with a request that surprised everyone present. "Sir, I request permission to accompany the assault team as mission medic," she said formally. "Given the medical intelligence we've gathered and the potential for complex trauma situations, I believe my presence with the assault force could be critical."
Rodriguez looked at her with a mixture of surprise and concern.
Combat medics typically accompanied patrol operations, but major assault missions usually relied on evacuation to base medical facilities for serious trauma treatment. Having a medic directly attached to an assault team was unusual and potentially dangerous. "Chen, this isn't a standard patrol operation," Rodriguez replied. "We're talking about a direct assault on a fortified position with significant enemy resistance expected. Your medical team here at base will be better positioned to handle casualties." "Sir, if my analysis is correct about enemy medical capabilities, we may face prolonged engagement with higher than anticipated casualty rates." Sarah persisted. Having advanced trauma capability directly with the assault force could mean the difference between life and death for wounded soldiers. "Colonel, this is exactly what I was talking about. Doc is trying to insert herself into combat operations that are outside her area of responsibility. We've got trained combat medics assigned to accompany the mission." Sarah turned to face Thompson directly, her voice calm but firm. "Sergeant, I am a trained combat medic with advanced trauma certification. My analysis of enemy capabilities suggests that standard medical support may be insufficient for this operation. I'm not trying to exceed my responsibilities, I'm trying to fulfill them effectively." The tension in the room was palpable as Rodriguez weighed his decision. On one hand, Sarah had proven her analytical skills and had earned increased respect for her insights. On the other hand, allowing her to accompany a major assault operation would set a precedent that might be seen as undermining established military protocols. After several moments of consideration, Rodriguez made his decision. "Chen, you'll accompany Alpha Squad as mission medic. But understand that this is a combat operation, and you'll be expected to perform under direct enemy fire. Your primary responsibility is medical care, but you may need to defend yourself and your patients." Sarah felt a surge of determination mixed with nervous anticipation. "Understood, sir. I won't let the team down." The helicopter flight to the target area was tense and quiet. Sarah sat among the assault team members, checking and rechecking her medical equipment while reviewing trauma protocols in her mind. The soldiers around her were professional but distant, still uncertain about having a relatively inexperienced medic accompanying them into direct combat. Sergeant First Class David Martinez, the squad leader, briefed Sarah on her role during the operation. "Doc, stay close to me during the initial assault. Once we secure the compound, you'll set up a casualty collection point in the main courtyard. If things go bad, your job is to keep wounded soldiers alive until we can get them to extraction." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of her responsibility. The soldiers she would be treating weren't just medical cases. They were fellow Americans whose lives depended on her skills and judgment, under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The compound appeared suddenly through the helicopter windows, a collection of mud brick buildings surrounded by high walls and defensive positions. Intelligence photos had shown the layout clearly, but seeing it from above gave Sarah a new appreciation for the complexity of the operation they were about to undertake. The helicopter touched down in a cleared area, approximately 500 meters from the target, and the assault team immediately began their approach through rough terrain that provided limited cover. Sarah moved with Alpha Squad, her medical pack weighing heavily on her shoulders as she navigated rocky ground and irrigation ditches. The first sign of resistance came from a sniper positioned in one of the compound's towers. The crack of his rifle echoed across the landscape, and Sarah heard the distinctive sound of bullets passing close overhead. The squad immediately took cover behind a low stone wall, and Martinez began coordinating the assault with the other teams approaching from different directions. "Contact front," Martinez called into his radio. "Sniper fire from the northeast tower. Alpha Squad taking cover at grid 041-852. Sarah pressed herself against the stone wall, her heart racing as she experienced direct enemy fire for the first time. Her training had prepared her for this moment, but the reality of combat was more intense and chaotic than any simulation could recreate. Around her, soldiers were returning fire with disciplined precision, their movements coordinated and professional despite the danger. The firefight intensified as insurgent forces throughout the compound began engaging the assault teams. Sarah could hear the distinctive sounds of different weapon systems,
The rapid fire of American M4 carbines, the deeper crack of AK-47s used by enemy forces, and the occasional explosion of grenades and rocket-propelled grenades. Martinez made the decision to advance toward the compound under covering fire from the other assault teams. "Move! Move!
Move," he shouted, and the squad began bounding forward in tactical formation. Sarah stayed close to Martinez as ordered, but her medical training made her intensely aware of the vulnerability of the soldiers around her. Every movement across open ground represented a risk, and she found herself mentally calculating treatment protocols for various types of combat injuries. The squad reached the compound's outer wall without casualties, but Sarah could hear radio reports indicating that Bravo squad had taken wounded during their approach. Her first test as a combat medic was about to begin, and she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. Martinez coordinated with the other squad leaders to breach the compound's main gate. The explosion echoed across the valley and smoke began pouring from the opening as the assault teams prepared to enter the hostile territory they had traveled so far to reach. "Alpha Squad, prepare to move through the breach," Martinez commanded. "Doc, stay close and be ready. We don't know what we're walking into." Sarah checked her medical equipment one final time and prepared to follow the squad through the breach. Her hands were steady, her mind focused on the medical challenges that lay ahead. She had proven her analytical skills and earned respect for her insights, but now she would have to demonstrate that she could perform under the ultimate pressure of direct combat. The assault teams moved through the breach in coordinated fashion, immediately encountering heavy resistance from insurgent forces positioned throughout the compound. The sound of gunfire was deafening, punctuated by explosions and the shouts of soldiers coordinating their movements. Sarah followed Alpha Squad toward the main courtyard, where Martinez planned to establish their initial foothold in the compound. However, as they rounded the corner of the main building, they walked into a carefully prepared ambush that would test every aspect of their training and courage. The enemy had positioned fighters with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades in elevated positions throughout the compound. As Alpha Squad entered the courtyard, they were immediately caught in crossfire from 3 different directions. The intensity of enemy fire was far greater than intelligence estimates had predicted, confirming Sarah's earlier concerns about the level of organization and preparation among insurgent forces. "Ambush! Take cover!" Martinez shouted as bullets began impacting around them. The squad scattered toward whatever protection they could find, but the open courtyard provided limited cover options. Sarah heard someone scream "medic," and her training immediately took over. Despite the continuing gunfire, she began moving toward the sound, her medical instincts overriding her survival fears. This was the moment she had trained for, the ultimate test of her commitment to her fellow soldiers. Private First Class James Wilson had taken a round through his leg and was bleeding heavily behind a low concrete barrier. Sarah reached him just as another burst of automatic weapons fire passed overhead, forcing her to take cover beside the wounded soldier. "Wilson, I'm here," she said calmly, her hands already beginning their assessment of his injuries. "Talk to me. How are you feeling?" Wilson's face was pale with shock and pain, but he managed to respond. "Doc, I can't feel my leg. There's so much blood." Sarah quickly cut away Wilson's uniform to assess the wound. The bullet had penetrated his thigh, possibly damaging the femoral artery. Without immediate intervention, he could bleed to death within minutes. However, treating him effectively would require several minutes of focused medical attention while under direct enemy fire. "Wilson, you're going to be fine," Sarah said with confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I need you to stay calm while I work on this. You're going home to see your family." As she began applying pressure to control the bleeding, Sarah became aware that her actions were being watched by other members of Alpha Squad. How she performed under these extreme conditions would determine not only Wilson's survival, but also her own credibility as a combat medic capable of functioning under direct enemy fire. The test of her courage and medical skills was just beginning, and Sarah knew that the next few minutes would define her role in the unit for the remainder of her deployment. She had proven her analytical abilities and earned intellectual respect, but now she had to demonstrate that she could save lives while bullets flew overhead and explosions shook the ground beneath her feet. Sarah worked with intense focus as bullets whistled overhead, and explosions rocked the compound around them. Private Wilson's life hung in the balance, and her training took complete control of her actions. She applied a tourniquet above the wound site, her fingers working with practiced precision despite the chaos surrounding them. The bleeding slowed significantly, but she could see that Wilson was going into shock from blood loss and trauma. "Stay with me, Wilson," she said firmly, checking his pulse and monitoring his breathing.
"I need you to focus on my voice and keep talking to me." The firefight raged around them as the other assault teams worked to clear the compound room by room.
Sarah could hear Martinez coordinating with other squad leaders over the radio, trying to establish control over a situation that had become far more complex than anyone had anticipated.
As she stabilized Wilson's condition, Sarah heard another call for medical assistance from across the courtyard. Specialist Rodriguez had taken shrapnel from a grenade explosion and was trapped behind a disabled vehicle with several other soldiers. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, with American forces taking more casualties than expected due to the sophisticated defensive preparations of enemy forces. Sarah faced a critical decision.
Wilson was stable for the moment, but he needed immediate evacuation to advanced medical facilities. However, Rodriguez was bleeding and needed immediate trauma care that only she could provide.
Leaving Wilson to treat Rodriguez meant risking both soldiers' lives, but staying with Wilson meant allowing Rodriguez to potentially bleed to death. Martinez, she called to the squad leader. I need 2 soldiers to carry Wilson to the extraction point. I've got another casualty that needs immediate attention. Martinez looked across the courtyard toward where Rodriguez was trapped, assessing the tactical situation with the practiced eye of an experienced combat leader.
The distance between Sarah's position and Rodriguez's location was approximately 30 meters of open ground covered by enemy fire from elevated positions. Doc, that's a kill zone, Martinez said bluntly. You'll never make it across that courtyard alive. Sarah checked Wilson's vital signs one final time and made her decision. Martinez Rodriguez is going to die if I don't get to him in the next few minutes. Wilson is stable and ready for evacuation.
Without waiting for approval, Sarah began preparing to move across the courtyard. She gathered the medical supplies she would need for trauma treatment and studied the pattern of enemy fire to identify the best route to Rodriguez's position.
Martinez grabbed her arm as she prepared to move. Chen, this is suicide. We can't afford to lose our medic attempting an impossible rescue. Sarah looked directly at Martinez, her voice calm but determined.
Sergeant, my job is to save the lives of American soldiers. Rodriguez is one of ours, and I'm not going to let him die, because the tactical situation is complicated.
Before Martinez could stop her, Sarah sprinted across the courtyard toward Rodriguez's position. Enemy fighters immediately concentrated their fire on her moving figure, and bullets impacted the ground around her feet as she zigzagged toward cover. The 30-meter distance seemed to stretch forever as Sarah ran through the kill zone. She could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to her head, and she felt the heat of muzzle flashes from enemy positions above her.
Her medical pack bounced heavily on her back and her lungs burned from the combination of adrenaline and physical exertion. She reached Rodriguez's position just as another burst of automatic weapons fire shattered the concrete barrier above their heads.
Rodriguez was conscious but pale from blood loss, with multiple shrapnel wounds across his chest and arms. The other soldiers with him had taken cover and were returning fire, but they lacked the medical training to treat his injuries effectively. Rodriguez, I'm here, Sarah said, immediately beginning her assessment of his wounds. Tell me where you're hit and how you're feeling. Rodriguez managed a weak smile despite his obvious pain. Doc, you're crazy for coming across that courtyard. I thought I was done for.
Sarah quickly identified the most serious of Rodriguez's injuries. A large piece of shrapnel had penetrated his chest near his collarbone, potentially damaging major blood vessels. She also found multiple smaller wounds that were bleeding steadily and contributing to his deteriorating condition. As she worked to control bleeding and stabilize Rodriguez's condition, Sarah became aware that enemy fire was concentrating on their position. The insurgent fighters had identified the casualty collection point and were attempting to prevent American forces from treating their wounded. We need to move Rodriguez to a more secure location, Sarah told the soldiers with her. This position is too exposed for extended medical treatment. Corporal Jackson, one of the soldiers providing security, pointed toward a more protected position near the main building.
Doc, there's better cover over there, but we'd have to move about 20 meters through partial concealment. Sarah looked at Rodriguez's condition and realized that moving him prematurely could worsen his injuries, but staying in their current position meant continued exposure to enemy fire. She made the decision to provide emergency stabilization treatment before attempting to move him. Working under direct enemy fire, Sarah inserted an IV line to begin fluid replacement therapy for Rodriguez's shock symptoms. Her hands remained steady despite the stress of the situation, and her medical training allowed her to focus completely on her patient's needs while bullets impacted around them. Jackson, I need you to help me carry Rodriguez to that covered position, Sarah instructed. We're going to move on my count, and I need you to maintain pressure on this chest wound while we move. The movement across 20 meters of partially concealed ground required precise timing and coordination.
Sarah and Jackson lifted Rodriguez between them, maintaining medical pressure on his wounds while moving as quickly as possible toward better cover. Enemy fighters tracked their movement and concentrated fire on their position. but the other members of Alpha Squad provided covering fire that forced the insurgents to take cover during the critical moments of the evacuation. The coordination between medical care and tactical support demonstrated the kind of integrated operation that effective combat units could achieve under extreme pressure. They reached the covered position successfully, and Sarah immediately resumed her medical treatment of Rodriguez's injuries. However, as she worked, she received word over the radio that fundamentally changed the tactical situation. "All assault teams, this is Overlord," came the voice of Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez over the radio. "We have reports of a large enemy force moving toward your position from the north. Estimated time to contact is 15 minutes. Prepare for immediate extraction." The implications of this development were serious. American forces had successfully penetrated the compound and were in the process of securing the target, but they now faced the prospect of being surrounded by superior enemy forces if they remained in place. However, extracting wounded soldiers under these conditions would require careful coordination and significant risk. Martinez's voice came over the radio with a situation report that made the challenges clear. "Overlord, Alpha Squad has 2 urgent surgical casualties requiring immediate evacuation. Doc Chen is providing trauma care, but both soldiers need advanced medical facilities within the next hour." The response from Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez was immediate and decisive. "Martinez, extraction helicopters are inbound to your position. Establish security perimeter and prepare wounded for immediate evacuation."
Sarah heard the radio traffic while continuing to treat Rodriguez's injuries, but she also understood the tactical implications of the situation. Extracting wounded soldiers under enemy fire was one of the most dangerous operations in combat, requiring precise timing and coordination between ground forces and helicopter crews.
As she stabilized Rodriguez's condition, Sarah realized that her role in the operation was about to become even more critical. The extraction would require her to maintain medical care for 2 seriously wounded soldiers while under direct enemy fire during helicopter loading operations. The sound of approaching helicopters could be heard in the distance, growing steadily louder as the extraction aircraft approached the compound. However, Sarah also became aware of increased enemy fire as insurgent forces attempted to prevent the successful evacuation of American casualties. "Doc, how are our wounded?" Martinez asked as he coordinated the extraction procedures with other squad leaders. Sarah checked both Wilson and Rodriguez one final time, ensuring that their conditions were stable enough for helicopter transport. "Both patients are stable for evacuation, but they need advanced surgical care as soon as possible." The extraction helicopters appeared over the compound, immediately drawing concentrated enemy fire from positions throughout the area. The aircraft began their approach to the landing zone that Alpha Squad had established in the courtyard, but Sarah could see tracer rounds passing near the helicopters as enemy fighters attempted to shoot them down.
"Smoke out!" Martinez called, and colored smoke grenades began marking the landing zone for the helicopter pilots.
The aircraft approached through the smoke, their door gunners returning fire against enemy positions while maintaining formation for landing. Sarah prepared Wilson and Rodriguez for loading onto the helicopter, coordinating with other soldiers to ensure that both wounded men could be moved safely and quickly. The helicopter would only be on the ground for a few seconds, requiring precise execution of the loading procedures. The first helicopter touched down in the courtyard, immediately coming under direct enemy fire from multiple directions. Sarah and 3 other soldiers lifted Wilson and began running toward the aircraft, maintaining medical support while moving across open ground under fire. They reached the helicopter successfully and loaded Wilson onto a medical stretcher inside the aircraft. Sarah provided a quick medical briefing to the flight medic, ensuring continuity of care during transport. However, as she prepared to return for Rodriguez, enemy fire intensified significantly. A rocket-propelled grenade exploded near the helicopter, forcing the aircraft to take off immediately to avoid destruction. Sarah found herself separated from Rodriguez by increasing enemy fire and the need for the helicopter to depart before taking critical damage. "Martinez, I need covering fire to get back to Rodriguez." Sarah called over the sound of gunfire and helicopter engines. The second extraction helicopter was approaching the landing zone, but enemy fire had become so intense that a successful extraction seemed increasingly unlikely. Sarah realized that getting Rodriguez to the aircraft would require extraordinary coordination and courage from everyone involved. Martinez organized covering fire from all available positions while Sarah prepared to move Rodriguez to the landing zone. The distance was only about 40 meters, but it represented some of the most dangerous ground on the battlefield. "On my mark," Martinez called, coordinating the movement with precision timing. "All positions. Provide maximum suppressive fire." Sarah and 2 other soldiers lifted Rodriguez and began their sprint toward the landing zone, as every American weapon in the compound opened fire on enemy positions. The volume of covering fire was tremendous, forcing insurgent fighters to take cover during the critical moments of the evacuation. The second helicopter touched down just as they reached the landing zone, and Rodriguez was quickly loaded onto medical stretchers inside the aircraft. Sarah provided another medical briefing to ensure continued care, but she realized that her own extraction was becoming problematic as enemy fire intensified around the helicopter.
"Doc, get on the bird," Martinez shouted over the noise of engines and gunfire. "You've done your job." Sarah looked back at the compound where American forces were still engaged in combat operations. She had successfully treated and evacuated 2 seriously wounded soldiers under extreme conditions, proving her value as a combat medic beyond any doubt. However, she also realized that her greatest contribution to the mission was still ahead of her.
Martinez, I'm staying with Alpha Squad, she called back. You still have soldiers in combat, and you might need medical support during the remainder of the operation. The helicopter pilot was gesturing urgently for immediate departure as enemy fire continued to target the aircraft. Sarah made her final decision and stepped back from the helicopter, allowing it to depart with Rodriguez while she remained with the assault team. As the helicopter lifted off and disappeared toward base camp, Sarah returned to her position with Alpha Squad for the final phase of the operation. She had proven her courage under fire and demonstrated her medical skills under the most extreme conditions possible.
However, more importantly, she had shown that dedication to fellow soldiers transcended traditional military hierarchies and role definitions. The compound was finally secured after 3 more hours of fighting, and the assault teams began their extraction with the knowledge that they had successfully completed their mission. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez was waiting when the teams returned to base, and his first question was about the performance of his soldiers during the operation. When Martinez briefed the commander on the mission's events, his account of Sarah's actions under fire was detailed and laudatory. Sir, Doc Chen saved 2 soldiers' lives under direct enemy fire and demonstrated courage that exceeded anything I've seen in 3 deployments. She's earned the respect of every soldier in this unit. Rodriguez listened to the briefing with growing respect for Sarah's performance.
The young medic had not only proven her analytical abilities but had demonstrated under the ultimate test that she possessed the courage and dedication that defined the finest American soldiers. "Where is Chen now?" Rodriguez asked. "Sir, she's in the aid station treating minor injuries from the operation," Martinez replied. "She insisted on completing medical checks for the entire assault team before getting any rest." Rodriguez found Sarah in the aid station, methodically treating cuts and bruises while debriefing each soldier about their medical condition during the operation. Her professional demeanor was unchanged, despite the extraordinary events of the day, and she continued to focus on the medical needs of her fellow soldiers.
"Chen," Rodriguez said formally, "I owe you an apology.
I underestimated your value to this unit, and your capabilities as a soldier decimated the mettle of the commander." Sarah looked up from her work, surprised by the commander's unexpected visit to the aid station.
"Sir, I was just doing my job. Every soldier in that compound performed beyond expectations today."
No, Shen, Rodriguez replied firmly.
"What you did today went far beyond job requirements. You demonstrated courage under fire and saved American lives under conditions that would challenge the most experienced combat veterans." The transformation in Rodriguez's attitude toward Sarah represented more than personal recognition. It reflected a broader understanding of how modern military operations required diverse expertise and perspectives. Sarah's medical training had provided unique insights into enemy capabilities, and her courage under fire had saved soldiers' lives during the most critical moments of combat. From that day forward, Sarah's role in the unit was fundamentally different. She participated in tactical planning as a valued team member, her medical insights were actively sought during mission preparation, and her courage under fire had earned the lasting respect of every soldier in the unit. Years later, when veterans of the deployment gathered to remember their service together, the story of the medic who risked everything to save the commander and his soldiers would be told with pride and admiration. Sarah had proven that heroism comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon on the battlefield is the steady hand of someone who refuses to let others die on their watch. The Medal of Valor she received for her actions that day represented more than individual recognition. It symbolized the understanding that modern military success requires every soldier to contribute their unique skills and perspectives to the mission. Sarah had shown that being called just a medic was never an insult. It was a recognition of someone trained to preserve life under the most difficult conditions imaginable. Her story became an inspiration to future generations of military medical personnel, demonstrating that courage and dedication know no boundaries of rank, gender, or military specialty.
In a profession where respect is earned through action, Sarah had proven that the heart of a true warrior beats strongest in those who fight to save lives rather than take them.